First-person shooter games, or FPS as I will now call them, have become a staple in the video game industry. It has created a competitive scene and generated a lot of early growth for the billion-dollar gaming industry we have today. It is arguably the most popular genre with many franchises such as Call of Duty, Half-Life, Fallout, Far Cry, CSGO, Battlefield, Halo, Valorant, Rainbow Six Siege, and Overwatch. While each game might not be great currently, they all had their time in the sun spread through decades with many others in between. It's crazy to believe a concept that started in 1973 has come all this way to lead the industry, spanning loads of subgenres with arcade, zombies, survival, RPG, tactical, roguelite, crime, looter, hunting, and horror. Thinking about it like that, it's kind of obvious why the genre exploded through the decades. First-person perspectives have always been a massive part of storytelling as it puts you in the story. Add the action side of things that has captured audiences, and you get an amazing story backed by amazing gameplay. A simple formula that has crafted masterpieces like Far Cry, BioShock, and Half-Life. These days, most FPS games have begun to lack such storytelling and innovative gameplay. So what led to the beginning, the peak, and the decline of first-person shooters? The FPS genre is said to have been born in 1973 without their creators knowing what type of game to even call it. The 1973 game Maze War was designed by 3 high school students for the PDS-1 minicomputer. One of the developers, Greg Thompson, brought his game to MIT after graduation, and it was a hit after the game was expanded to an 8-player multiplayer. The game grasped the whole school, including some of the management. It would become so popular that MIT would have to work on banning it on computers because so much time was being spent playing it. Maze was also credited with other firsts such as Level Editor and Radar, just to name a few. It was a very influential game, but has not received as much attention because of how limited the hardware was in 1973. It wasn't until 1980 that another development was made for FPS. Battlezone for the Atari arcade became the father of arcade shooters with its first-person perspective of a tank. While not being the shooter we see today, it was a development and scheming of controls and hardware starting to push games past computers. Today, Wolfenstein is considered the godfather of the FPS genre. It was a large change from the scroller shooters that made up most of the FPS genre at the time. The developers ID Software expected to get about $60,000 in the first month, but had expectations blown away with a $100,000 check in just the first month. It was the top shareware of 1992, and by the end of 93, the title had sold over 100,000 units. It received a handful of awards in 1992 and marked a huge movement in the development of the FPS genre. Today, Wolfenstein 3D is somewhat overshadowed because of the FPS game that followed in 1993. ID Software followed up Wolfenstein 3D with Doom 1993. Doom was a phenomenal overnight success, immediately making $100,000 daily. It is estimated to have sold a monumental 200,000 units in just the first year. Furthermore, shareware was rarely bought and usually hacked to bypass the purchasing phase. It estimated that about 1% of people actually even bought Doom. Doom received enormous praise, being called the best game ever for not only its influence but new thrilling style of gameplay. It is without a doubt the father of FPS. Even today, 30 years later, almost everyone knows the influence Doom has had on our most beloved FPS games. With the massive evolution of FPS games, what could possibly come next to carry the burden coming after the father? Turns out no one could touch the success of Doom except its creators, ID Software again, who would have to deliver another massive FPS game. In the middle of 1996, they did just that with the release of Quake. ID Software took everything from Doom and basically improved it for Quake. The overhaul of the multiplayer being the biggest stride. It added 8-player support and continued to provide the online mode with more customizations for the players with TCP and IP connections. The Quake engine also was fully 3D rendered, unlike Doom, which is more of a 2.5D, as enemies were 2D and your character model was 3D. Quake was only able to stand on its own without Doom because of the 3D rendering and the creation of multiplayer movement styles. Quake is credited with inventing the bunny hopping, strafe jumping, and rocket jumping. It received critical appeal for the new movement as players loved the more aggressive manner and better control of their character. After selling over 300,000 copies in its first year, Quake would actually have an esports scene. The Quake tournament, Red Annihilation, would be the first nationwide tournament in 1997. The top 16 players were flown out to Atlanta, Georgia, and competed in the same building. Spectators could watch via in-game cameras, and the final morning of the tourney was even displayed on the floor show by NBC's Today and the Wall Street Journal. Quake truly did encapsulate the spirit of Doom and continue to push it out onto the world. Doom and Quake, the Father and the Son. Quake 2 would release the following year in 1997, but it did not offer a lot of impactful change to the FPS genre. It was still loved and heavily sold. The real highlight of 1997, though, was GoldenEye 000, developed by Rare and published by Nintendo. Based on the 1995 James Bond film, it retained amazing graphics and detailed environments throughout different levels. GoldenEye went a completely different route from the mayhem of Doom. You were an agent who needed to destroy objects and had to take out enemies without the crazy weapons from Doom or Quake. It was a fresh, because it was probably the first, stealth FPS that captured the movie exceptionally well. Being published by Nintendo, GoldenEye was released on the N64 instead of past PC FPS games. It was revolutionary to have a home console with not only an amazing FPS single-player experience, but also 4-player multiplayer. It also changed the way guns were handled. A Team Fortress mod on Quake invented headshots, which GoldenEye took and elaborated on using scoped weapons, adding more thoughtful critical aim. A monumental success that was compared to top Nintendo games like Mario Kart 64 and Super Mario 64. The attention to detail and story is what created the next amazing FPS in 1998. Doom is the Father and Quake is the Son, then Half-Life is the Holy Spirit. Developed by Valve, it was a massive step into story-driven FPS games. Half-Life was created because Valve was tired of seeing uncreative Doom clones that were just adrenaline-filled shooters. They wanted to create a diverse plot with so much detail like GoldenEye, but with the action and FPS feel of Doom. Originally expecting Half-Life to sell 180,000 units in its lifetime, Valve was blown away by the success it saw. In 2 months, Half-Life sold over 200,000 units, receiving enormous praise. It was even said to be the best FPS since Doom itself started it all. Half-Life was boosted by new hardware that allowed the game to progress without level select screens and minimal loading times. The different chapter names would just appear at the top of the screen and fade away, leaving the player fully immersed in the amazing 3D world. It would also popularize scripted sequences to boost the story quality. Most games had cutscenes at the time, so having cutscenes while the player still had control was a crazy idea. Half-Life really changed how games were developed and written for the better. While Half-Life has multiplayer and mod support like most games, Half-Life showed that the multiplayer was not all FPS games were about and could have compelling storytelling. Half-Life received so much popularity, it was even given a console version on the PS2, helping consoles get a more serious look into getting many of the popular PC games like GoldenEye had done. The end of the 20th century finished with another Valve game, Team Fortress Classic and Quake 3, which was multiplayer focused. These games didn't change a lot in FPS, but were still very popular games and showcased new technology and styles of games. With the birth of FPS games in the late 20th century, it was during the 2000s that FPS games would really explode. In 1999, Valve's baby Half-Life was a very modded game. One of the most popular mods was called Counter-Strike. It was such a large hit in the community that Valve would obtain the intellectual property rights and produce a retail version in November of 2000. Counter-Strike is and was a massive hit. It sold 250,000 copies in just 6 months, and eventually would sell 1.5 million by February of 2003. Counter-Strike was so popular, it even got an Xbox port that sold 1.5 million in its lifetime. The game was a revolutionary success because of its change in gameplay. Previous Doom-related FPS games lacked strategy and were mostly just run-and-gun shooters. Counter-Strike took a completely different approach by using a bomb defusal, hostage, and assassination mode that were timed and came in rounds. Money was earned each round to buy stronger guns until a team reached a certain amount of points depending on the game mode. Incredibly, 2 of the original game modes have actually survived until the current day throughout all of Valve's Counter-Strike games. With the strategic gameplay, an esports was born. Counter-Strike is probably the first real esports because it wasn't just a one-off tournament, but something made to last. In 2003, Counter-Strike would have its first major in Dallas with a $150,000 prize pool, which today equates to $250,000. A cult following was built and the rest is history, which we'll touch on later as CS is the most influential game to creating the esports scene and it came out over 20 years ago. 2001 would mark the creation of another juggernaut in the FPS world. Halo Combat Evolved was developed by Bungie and published by Microsoft for the Xbox and eventually ported to PC in 2003. From the beginning, Halo would give us gaming icon Master Chief and the intense sci-fi warfare of it all. This game did not receive universal hype as the previous, but did sell about 1 million units with a lot of them attached to Xbox sales. The game helped modernize FPS games at the time with stellar graphics and split screen for multiplayer and the campaign. Combat Evolved is also thought to have caused Xbox to thrive and be what it is today. In 2002, Electronic Arts, or EA, published Battlefield 1942. This is probably the first game that wasn't met with the enormous hype. The game sold about 700,000 units in the US by 2006, which is good, but below other games listed previously. The reason I bring up this game is because it was the first FPS game that introduced the genre into actual warfare. 64-player games led to absolute chaos of war with tanks, planes, submarines, carriers, and good old ground troops. The game would also push classes like support, medic, assault, and recon. With large maps, Battlefield would create a natural battle with capture points that would be forced to hold in order to win. Even as the first in the series in 2002, it is one of the most beloved of the franchise. The final pillar of the FPS genre that was created in the early 2000s has to be Call of Duty. In 2003, Infinity Ward and Activision put together the first Call of Duty game for one of the biggest FPS franchises to this day. Call of Duty received several Game of the Year awards and outsold Battlefield 1942 through the years. The campaign was loved as an AI squad would follow you through it at your side, taking down enemies with you, which at the time was the first time it was done so well. It also featured a varied campaign during World War II with an American, British, and Soviet viewpoint. It was an amazing intro to a new style and will obviously show up again. The games of the late 20th century made the FPS genre we enjoy today. These early 2000s games have continued exactly where they left off, working to make the FPS genre into the biggest of games we see now. 2004 continued this as it was quite the big year in FPS game releases. Far Cry, Star Wars Battlefront, and COD on console all started the early growth of their respective franchises. Other big releases that year were Halo 2, Half-Life 2, and CS Source. CS Source, while having a lukewarm release at the time, would ultimately set up the future of Counter-Strikes because this put it in Valve's new Source engine that has improved the state of the game over all this time. Also from Valve was Half-Life 2, which brought more of the same FPS storytelling along with new features with vehicles and physics-based engine updates. The new updates and amazing continued attention to detail has made the game probably one of the most well-rated games ever. Receiving many perfect and near perfect reviews, it is stated that in 2011, the game had even sold 12 million copies worldwide. Half-Life 2 being a product of Valve helped solidify Steam as a major PC game store. The success of Half-Life 2 went so far beyond FPS games, touching everything close related. To be honest though, Half-Life 2 wasn't alone. In fact, a week before Half-Life 2 released, Halo 2 had the biggest game launch ever. 3 weeks before Halo was out, it was reported that 1.5 million copies were pre-ordered, making it the highest selling game on release. The story wasn't perfect, but created a gripping cliffhanger that set up a sequel. The game really thrived on multiplayer. Halo 2 definitely made multiplayer games what they are today. It was the first to use automated matchmaking, lobbies, and clans. At the time, you had to choose servers, but with Halo 2, you would select a playlist of maps or game modes, and just get automatically put into games in your region. You don't even have to think about that anymore because of how universally used it is now. Many weapons were also added along with dual wielding and was definitely the best multiplayer game at the time. Halo 2 would forever change how FPS games would work with online multiplayer. As 2005 rolled around, it was something of a cooldown year. It would be almost impossible to pass the amount of amazing things that came from 2004. It tried though with Quake 4, Battlefield 2, and COD 2 as the main releases. Quake 4 was seen as somewhat uninspired, as it wasn't much of an improvement over past titles besides the graphical changes. Battlefield 2 on the other hand was a huge hit. Ironically, the only complaints were bugs and glitches, which is something that's kind of the norm with Battlefields these days, so don't be too surprised that your Battlefield games have bugs. Battlefield 2 created the squads features that created more teamwork in turn, which really worked to get more realism in what captured the feeling of war the franchise had been going for. The game sold 1.2 million copies in 1 month and little over 2 million over the course of the year. It definitely is the biggest Battlefield 2 release at that time, doing what 1942 did, but even better. Call of Duty 2 also saw similar success to Battlefield 2. The title saw high praise on the graphics, story, and audio, really capturing the intense war cinematics. The game introduced a health regeneration system and a grenade icon that were both welcome features. Call of Duty 2 was the biggest title launch for the Xbox 360, selling 1.5 million units in a year. Its biggest contribution to FPS was being both for Xbox and PC, as most games were still launching on one or the other. Bringing console and PC into FPS would be best for the genre, as split franchises never really reached their full potential. 2006 wouldn't really offer a lot to further the FPS genre, but it did come out with Half-Life 2, Battlefield 2142, and Call of Duty 3. Battlefield 2142 was probably the most revolutionary game, as it added mechs that you could use in combat. It was referred to as Titan mode, but these also brought a lot of bugs, which wasn't really liked at the time. But people did like the innovative gameplay that came with the new technology of it being 2142. Call of Duty 3 was more of the same of Call of Duty 2, but with a little more updates in the mechanics to feel better and just more weaponry and classes. The final main game of 2006 would be Half-Life 2 Episode 1, which received a lot of praise after providing another character, Alex, but really didn't do a lot that previous Half-Life games hadn't already done. 2007, on the other hand, was a completely new beast, possibly outdoing 2004 with the amazing amount of FPS games that would tear up the new scene. Half-Life 2 Episode 2, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, Team Fortress 2, Crysis, Halo 3, and BioShock. This was probably the best year for gaming as a whole. If you look at the releases of games in 2007, I think you'll understand. Half-Life 2 Episode 2 got its flowers for graphical upgrades and expanded environments, but still just kind of fell short like Episode 1, as it was just a 6-hour episode and didn't do little else but show off new graphical advances. Team Fortress 2 by Valve was widely successful. Loved for the art style and goofy gameplay that stood out, as a lot of FPS games went for more realism, taking themselves very seriously. Although the popularity has wavered, TF2 still maintains a cult following a decade and a half later. Crysis received a lot of praise for having graphics and physics ahead of its time. The only drawback would be the monster PC needed to run it with graphics that high. Crysis was also considered something of a Halo killer, as it was a similar sci-fi FPS experience, but obviously Crysis didn't kill Halo. Even more unfortunate for Crysis is that Halo 3 came out the same year, and saying it was massive doesn't even do it justice. Halo 3 was pre-ordered by more than 1 million people in North America alone, beating Halo 2 by grossing $170 million in the first day of its release. Halo 3 would sell 3.3 million units in the first 12 days in the US. Somehow Halo 3 lived up to all the expectations set by Halo 2, creating the best multiplayer experience to date. It would also wrap up the previous game stories, bringing a must-see end to the trilogy. Not only were maps tuned, but the Forge was also introduced, allowing for custom map creation for whole new game modes. While not adding a lot to the FPS genre in terms of innovation, Halo 3 was probably so many gamers' first FPS ever, and there was no way they could ever escape playing more of the genre. Don't tell Japan, but Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was probably the second nuke that landed in 2007. COD 4 pulled itself out of World War II and into the modern age with so many new features. It was the first COD game to have custom classes and kill streaks, which have become immovable staples in the franchise. An amazing campaign that featured many different playable characters whose stories all intertwined was received with enormous praise. The multiplayer didn't slack off either, as it was said to rival Halo 3 at the time. It would actually outsell Halo 3 because of Activision's decision to put the game on everything: PC, Xbox 360, PS3, and even the Wii. It didn't change the genre as a whole, but practically perfected it, and would set up future games to continue to be amazing FPS games for the genre. The final big game of 2007 is BioShock. BioShock is universally acclaimed as a beautiful yet brutal game that could immerse any player into the deep storytelling. The game makes you feel as it displays political criticism and objective theming, showing that taking care of yourself should be the top of your priority. It was able to transcend so many art forms with its unique art and smooth graphics that would all work in creating the amazing story that even had 2 different endings. BioShock was basically a new age Half-Life game with its impact. It showed that storytelling was still possible with video games, and could grasp audiences without multiplayer. 2007 is the peak of SPS genre, and while it doesn't get bad immediately after, it's just that 2007, everything was achieved with amazing storytelling, multiplayer, and graphical updates. Everything from 1992 building up to reach 2007, the year that made first-person shooters whole. 2008 introduced a lot of new sequels, and one main new game. Firstly, Call of Duty World at War, which was something of a step back as it went back to the generic World War II model. However, the game did feature a spin-off mode that would change future installments heavily. After the player beat the campaign, the player would unlock a new game mode called Nazi Zombies. It was a very bare-bones version of what we have today, but it all started because of how it grasped fans. Moving on, we reach Fallout 3 and Far Cry 2, which were not just basic sequels, as they offered way more than their original games. Far Cry 2 came out 1 week earlier and adopted an open-world setting for its games, which differed from the first installment. It was almost off-putting at the time to have an FPS game containing so much. It would be the first FPS game to jump into the new open-world setting and was praised for its innovation and also hardcore nature. Fallout 3 was much of the same, except it actually came from a top-down perspective in the previous games, still capturing the RPG elements from the previous games Fallout 2 and Fallout 1, and combining the open world. Fallout 3 was ambitious, and it paid off. It was a big hit and captured the fun of video games all around through leveling, exploration, and even fun combat with 50 unique guns. Fallout 3 would win over Far Cry 2 as the better open world experience because of their push for innovation in the FPS sphere by adding RPG elements and open world. The final mainline games of 2008 were Battlefield Bad Company and the new Left 4 Dead series. Battlefield Bad Company was loved because it introduced a largely destructible environment and a large variety of weapons and vehicles to go with it. Left 4 Dead was a fresh face in the FPS community and was a smash hit. Players and critics loved how well it captured the zombie experience seen in movies at the time. It was the first game to really popularize the zombie FPS genre, and was said to be one of the best current co-op shooters of the day. 2009 was more the same, with a lot of sequels like Arma 2, Left 4 Dead 2, Halo 3 ODST, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and Battlefield 1943. While these games were very successful, with Modern Warfare 2 and Halo 3 ODST being the heavy hitters, there wasn't really evolution left for them to improve. Call of Duty was on its 6th game, and Battlefield 1943 was its 7th, and Halo 3 ODST was just more of a story venture and the 4th game. Left 4 Dead is a little different, as it was only the 2nd game, so adding just a few ideas, but being a lot more polished with many more maps and features, it was more understanding as a bigger hit. Still though, 2009 was still a real setback in innovation for the SPS realm, except for a brand new franchise from Gearbox Software in 2K, Borderlands. While the game was not a massive success like Halo, it did lead to the popularity of a new genre in the FPS sphere, that being looter shooters. Borderlands may not be the first, as games had taken a similar path, but Borderlands definitely was the best in terms of loot and shooting mechanics. It created a lot of clones flocking to the scene and jump-started the new franchise. 2010, while offering more sequels, absolutely popped off with BioShock 2, Halo Reach, Black Ops 1, Fallout New Vegas, and Battlefield Bad Company 2. Halo Reach, like every new Halo title, topped the franchise record with $200 million in first-day sales. The game was praised for bringing the good of all previous games together and for creating a unique story that had new characters for the focus. Black Ops 1 was received well, but this was the first time fans began to murmur that it was just another yearly edition the franchise would pump out every single year. The biggest signs of ingenuity was probably the zombies, as World at War was the only COD to do it 2 years earlier. Black Ops 1 was able to really expand on it and make it feel like a mode that had a lot of attention and care put into it, by creating narratives and just adding more features all around. Although the idea wasn't exactly original, Black Ops 1 did jumpstart the zombies mode made by Treyarch that would receive a lot of love in the future. Black Ops 1 would also be credited with a lot of iconic maps like the legendary Nuketown and even stuff like Firing Range that would come back later. BioShock 2 didn't exactly meet publisher expectations, but is still a beloved game by fans today. Possibly the biggest reason it struggled is that it didn't distinguish itself from the previous game enough, just feeling a little lazy in the writing and honestly showing nothing new in gameplay. Battlefield Bad Company 2, on the other hand, became the best-selling Battlefield game quickly. The multiplayer was adored and it was densely populated to really feel alive, and was once again built to be destructible. It was built off the Battlefield Bad Company game, so things still felt familiar, but honestly a great addition and sequel to the original. Fallout New Vegas continued the franchise trend with plenty of bugs and was not very progressive to the story. It might have been an improvement on Fallout 3, but felt too familiar and sterile story-wise, as it didn't top Fallout 3 in reviews or sales. 2010 was a great year for FPS fans, but didn't bring anything innovative to the table, as everything was rehashed just as better versions. 2010 meant a new decade, and already showed a lot of regression in terms of innovation in the FPS scene. Games can be good, but what happens when companies keep using these good game formulas over the course of several years? Spoilers, it's going to decline, exactly like you remember, with your favorite franchises looking like shells without anything groundbreaking. 2011 is just 2010 again, with Crysis 2, Battlefield 3, Modern Warfare 3, and even Duke Nukem Forever just adding to the continued sequel dogpile. One game that may not have stuck out at the time was Payday the Heist, developed by Overkill Software. Only selling 700,000 units and receiving grounded reviews, it went by a lot of radars, with new sequels carrying out existing franchises. It was a fresh face after all, creating a new approach to FPS games. Being based on heists, players would rob a bank by taking hostages and avoided killing civilians. Its environments created new levels of strategy and a lot of replayability, as events and levels would be random. This first game may not have been the greatest, but it was enough for Overkill to continue on and make a future juggernaut. 2012 literally had nothing new to give to the future of FPS games, but it did have 5 massive installments that had taken place. Quite possibly the greatest shooter ever came out, and that would be CSGO. An obvious masterpiece, took a little time at first, but would come around to shape esports and remain as one of the most played games for 10 years before evolving with Valve's new Source engine. Even though it was the 4th game in the series, it has changed so much about the current landscape of not only esports but FPS tactical shooters, as many have come and gone trying to capture the magic that is CSGO. Black Ops 2 released and was a massive hit, being the highest grossing piece of entertainment until GTA 5 the next year, making $500 million in 24 hours of its release. But changed little as the Call of Duty franchise continued to grow without innovation. Halo 4 was received well at the time and reintroduced Master Chief. It beat Halo Reach in first day sales, but today is remembered as more of the downfall in Halo, as it just continued the same formula. Far Cry 3 released and is known as the best game of the franchise, but received a little criticism for being a cliche story and genuinely uninspired, as it just developed on Far Cry 2, but still being only the 3rd game in the franchise, it's not the worst thing ever. It was played safe, but featured an amazing cast of characters that would keep it in the 2nd best selling game behind BO2 for a majority of its lifetime. Borderlands 2 received a deserved sequel, as the budget was increased at least quadruple from the first game. Similar to Far Cry 3, I would also give this game a pass because it was a clear upgrade that helped push the FPS looter shooter genre further by having a real AAA game that would ship 5 million units in just 2 months. 2013 was a mix of great, new, and bad. Battlefield 4, Call of Duty Ghosts, and Crysis 3 came out, and I don't really feel like I need to say anything about those, as 2 of them were just yearly releases, and Crysis 3 did not do well. BioShock Infinite, on the other hand, received the most praise for FPS games this year, as the story, setting, and visual design were downright insane. The genre would receive plenty of life with this edition because of the brilliant storytelling and gameplay to match. DayZ and Rust would appear in early access forms this year, which showed off hardcore FPS survival games in a largely multiplayer settings. The 2 games took off, and Rust would receive the upper head, selling more games even though released after DayZ. Today, the 2 games are still played, with Rust still being widely popular and DayZ's player count dwindling. It was really cool to see 2 different FPS games released this year though, that were both going after the same genre. While the new genre created by these 2 games didn't exactly blow up, it's eerily similar to the Battle Royale genre, just that it's played through games instead of just taking place on a server. I don't think all the credit goes to DayZ or Rust for creating the enormous Battle Royale genre, but I do think some has to be had for how the games played out in relation to something like H1Z1 or PUBG. Payday 2 would make huge leaps from the original Payday this year, creating enough hype to pay off the entire game from just pre-orders alone. In 2023, it was reported that Payday 2 sold 40 million units, and a 3rd installment was in development. Thankfully, for FPS lovers alike, 2014 would bring some real good games to make up for some of the previous year just being so bland. Far Cry 4 and Advanced Warfare were the main sequels, and they were received well, but didn't exceed previous titles. Wolfenstein: The New Order rebooted the story and was the first of a new series. While New Order isn't an original idea, it brings a new story, good detailed settings, and engaging gameplay while also giving more complexity to Blazkowicz, the protagonist. Another top single-player game dropped that year called Alien Isolation. Alien Isolation would capture such a daunting and dread-filled atmosphere for an FPS game. BioShock was able to do it, but had a lot more focus on story elements and shooting. Alien Isolation was made less for shooting and more for running and hiding, capturing the same dark and hopeless environment of Outlast with a hint of shooter for more action. Multiplayer games even saw new titles like Titanfall, Destiny, and a first look at Overwatch with a closed beta later. Titanfall is probably the most dynamic FPS in modern gaming. Its dynamic between blending combat between bigger, clunky titans and stealthy, slick pilots is extremely innovative. Even the process of calling and entering titans was praised by just the feeling Respawn captured. Destiny took a lot of MMO elements and combined it with a FPS looter shooter, leading to an addicting and interesting amalgamation. Backed by Bungie, who had Halo in their pocket for a multiplayer experience, the maps and gameplay were enjoyed, with really only the story lacking as Bungie was still trying to figure out the narrative. Overwatch had a closed beta beginning in late 2014 that would go until release in 2016. The beta was rather basic, so I'll get into Overwatch more in 2016. It did look promising though at the E3 presentation. 2015 would be the start of the second half of the decade, and honestly the first half was pretty strong. Innovation in the gaming sphere as a whole was slowing down, so no surprise to see FPS games struggling to have new ideas come up successfully, but it still wasn't impossible, with Rust and Payday showing up along with Overwatch at the very end, giving a glimpse at just new shooters coming around. The early 2010 games were less about innovation and more about creating a strong foundation for gaming as well. CSGO established a healthy esports scene that would stand the test of time, unlike previous titles like Halo. Black Ops 2 propelled itself out of just FPS games as one of the most successful games ever to that point. A few new subgenres would blossom out like looter shooters and heist games from this era. With the already dwindling innovation, I have a feeling the quick game highlights I talk about are about to get shorter. So into 2015 we go. First thing we're going to hit is Halo 5. It would continue the trend of Halo losing popularity as really the only established fan base played it, and even they were rather bummed by its mediocre gameplay and story. Battlefield Hardline attempted to innovate by moving Battlefield to a police theme, but was so poorly executed that it was one of the worst Battlefield releases to date, with plenty of technical bugs and honestly a disjointed story. Fallout 4 was a strong game, winning multiple rewards, but at the time was being kind of overshadowed by The Witcher. Probably the best FPS of 2015, Fallout 4 sacrificed some of its RPG elements for better gunplay that players felt enhanced the overall feel of the game, but in the scheme of gaming, The Witcher was able to do the RPG elements more, which was more sought after. Without a compelling story, it wasn't the best game, but did break Steam Day 1 unit sales with 1.2 million, as well as passing GTA 5 for having the most concurrent players on a non-Steam game with 470,000. A very strong open-world FPS title that somewhat perfected the formula. Black Ops 3 would become the best-selling game of 2015 with a strong launch. It didn't do much for the formula, and that was somewhat expected at this point, but it did offer a very fine polish on zombies, as this was considered the peak of zombies game mode, with over 10 maps and a custom map feature for PC. The multiplayer followed Advanced Warfare with the futuristic take and was met with mixed response. The game is memorable as those who have enjoyed the franchise for the previous decade know exactly what comes next. Wolfenstein Old Blood is a prequel to New Order, and honestly it didn't do much in sales or awards. It gave some context to the events of New Order, which must have been part of the reason it was pretty safe. Rainbow Six Siege would be the best FPS game released in this time. It wasn't a first month or even year success. A lot of hit detect issues and gunplay feeling unpolished hindered its competitive scene, but it showed a lot of promise year one. The very tactical gunplay that features destructible environments, a scouting phase, and intense angles. Just like in the popular title CSGO, you could go down in one instance and be out for the rest of the round. The game would peak around 2020 and 2021 with the help of the pandemic, really making gamers search for new ways to spend time on new games. Moving to 2016, it was a fine year with Doom 2016, Superhot, Titanfall 2, Overwatch, Battlefield 1, and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. Getting the obvious out first, Infinite Warfare was bad and just another yearly slop release. Sequels come next with Titanfall 2 perfecting the Titanfall formula. It is known as the better Titanfall game and even had a killer campaign that featured the beloved BT. The multiplayer was known for being Call of Duty done right, as many recent CODs failed to capture the futuristic nature for FPS games. Titanfall 2 has yet to see a sequel as the developers are unsure how to make a new game feel unique enough, respectable as this game actually sees a resurgence every now and then. The other sequel in 2016 would be Battlefield 1. Flipping the setting to World War II, it was now seen as somewhat of a commercial success and a fresh change of new mechanics. The game was solid, but not exactly groundbreaking. Doom 2016, Overwatch, and Superhot would be the most memorable FPS games of 2016, and are actually still impressive today, besides maybe Doom. Doom 2016 was a reboot and the first main title in over 10 years. It featured aggressive, brutal combat compared to the ancient first two games. The single-player mode had a fantastic soundtrack that would match the gunplay of just being in the middle of such action. It sold well enough to get a sequel that we'll touch on later. The more innovative games would be Overwatch and Superhot that year. Overwatch would explode as almost 10 million players would tune into the beta and eventually be the highest grossing game of 2016, making close to $1 billion in just 6 months. Overwatch took the class system and gave it personality, calling them heroes. While they're divided as tank, damage, and support, each character has a unique design and personality. It will receive several awards, including Game of the Year from various shows, which was uncommon for FPS games at this time. Overwatch would be so successful they would even take on a massive esports endeavor that maybe was a little too ambitious, but did highlight just how popular the game had become. Innovation still existed in the FPS genre after all. This would be even more reinforced by a surprisingly good game called Superhot. The game took on a fresh take for FPS games by moving away from the simple FPS formula and creating something very original. The game's use of time manipulation and simplistic art design would push it forward in being a top game of the year. It would even receive a VR version at the end of 2016 and was met with even more praise, being the best way to play it. Today is still one of the best-selling VR games and definitely one of the most unique experiences for not just VR but shooters in general. 2015 and 2016 would actually be strong years for FPS games as each showed off new ideas and strong established titles that might have lacked creativity but were polished and fun. 2017 is a quick year for FPS games with really just Destiny 2, Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus, and COD World War II. Honorable mention going to Prey, which I had never heard of and don't feel comfortable enough to discuss, but it did seem to have a decent appeal to story-driven FPS lovers. COD World War II actually received praise for its campaign being gripping and moving with amazing visuals and audio. It had a very human element not seen in a while. The rest was pretty much just a normal yearly slop though. Wolfenstein 2 was a strong release for the franchise, but wasn't really anything of note as it was just a sequel, although it is well liked for the improvements it made compared to New Order. Destiny 2, something of a hot topic today, but at the time received quite a good reception. The only criticism was really just that it seemed like an expansion, as it felt like the original, but with more stuff to do, so kind of a, like 1.5. But Bungie would continue to improve the gunplay and world building. Bungie's pretty much a master at providing mechanically gifted FPS games, and this would put that to the test with shooting elements of a variety of weapons combined with seemingly magic mechanics. Destiny 2 is known as the most successful live service FPS game ever. Being really the only one to still exist, it has put out so much content throughout the years, taking elements from MMOs to truly make it one of the best looter shooters ever. 2018 is probably the worst year for FPS games so far. I think a lot had to do with Battle Royale shooters just exploding in late 2017, so a lot of development went there. A lot of the early Battle Royales were third person, so FPS games took a bit of a dive. Anyway, 2018 brought Insurgency Sandstorm, Battlefield V, Far Cry 5, Black Ops 4, and a little spice with a little Deep Rock Galactic in early access. Insurgency Sandstorm is the second game in the franchise and had much needed improvement on the first game, along with perfecting the mix of COD with the slow-paced tactical design of the game. The game also featured mod support. It was a strong release by small developers that would stay connected to the fanbase, listening to complaints they had about changes. Battlefield V was another World War II game, and yeah, that's it. It was alright. Far Cry is another Far Cry game? Oh look, I don't know, it's Far Cry 5, I don't really know what you want from me. I'm being as creative as they are at this point because it was kind of a lame story in an amazing world. Ubisoft still managed a very strong open world design, but just couldn't put it together with a strong story or really any unique features. Black Ops 4 was a mess. The game had no campaign because Call of Duty was dipping its toes in the Battle Royale through Blackout. Blackout being the beginning of Warzone is honestly respectable, although it did up being somewhat disappointing, which is why the next year, Warzone would take over the Battle Royale mantle for Call of Duty. However, Blackout was a good change to see in COD as it was the first FPS-only Battle Royale to really take off. The zombies suck though, not gonna get over that. Luckily, a new game would show signs of greatness in the making. Deep Rock Galactic, a game of dwarves, mining, beer, and good old-fashioned first-person shooting. A weird combination that would get in early access this year. It'll be released in 2020, which is when I'll give it more of its flowers. 2019 is bad. I still think Battle Royale just had a lingering effect on FPS games, but honestly, gaming in general. Borderlands 3 is just more slop. Wolfenstein Youngblood is uninspired and did not have likable characters, and Far Cry New Dawn, which was honestly just another Far Cry game, which was unsurprisingly not good, so we'll move on. Now, there are a few other games that were good or at least decent. Outer Worlds was an original game that did receive awards and praise, but it was really just a condensed Fallout. It had a smaller world, but kept most of the RPG elements that Fallout was loved for. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019 is a fantastic shooter that had very refined shooting mechanics and brought Warzone out that is still adapted today because of the popularity it received during this game. Campaign was cool, but essentially a recycled reboot. It's probably the best COD in the last 5 years, if that really means anything to you. The best FPS release of this year was undoubtedly Apex Legends. And wouldn't you know, it was a Battle Royale. Apex Legends was rather unique as it used a legend system, similar to Overwatch, to select pre-made characters that had a unique ability separating itself from Warzone and Fortnite. As I mentioned, it was something of an Overwatch meets Warzone, as the smooth shooting and unique characters boosted Apex Legends to be the biggest shooter over Fortnite for a small period of time. And that was the end of the 2010s. A hot start, reinforced midpoint, and something of a bleeding end. Sure, we had Warzone and Apex Legends kind of pick up Battle Royale, but for first person only, but it still really wasn't enough to carry there towards 2018 and 19. Really just all the poor sequels and uninspired plus uninnovative, just slop. 2020 was a massive year for gaming. Everyone being forced inside caused a large demand for new or replayable games to absorb the hours stuck inside. A few FPS games would be able to get dropped, being Valorant, Doom Eternal, Deep Rock Galactic, Half-Life Alyx, and COD Black Ops Cold War. Black Ops Cold War is one of the best-selling COD games, selling over 30 million, but it was honestly actually trash. Turns out Treyarch got a little lucky because Cold War today is seen as one of the worst Call of Duty games despite sales. I guess people really just needed something to play and, well, go to old reliable. The other games, on the other hand, did very well. Doom Eternal was a large success. coming out even better than the previous Doom 2016. As its sequel, it did amazing in improving gameplay mechanics and soundtracks. It doubled Doom 2016 first week sales and was said to have grossed $500 million in 1 year, which means it was a massive commercial success, obviously. Half-Life Alyx dropped a few days after Doom Eternal. Half-Life Alyx was a profound FPS game as it was specifically designed by Valve to be a VR title. Like the original Half-Life 20 years before, Half-Life Alyx would push the bar on the technical abilities of VR in the form of an FPS, while also putting together a brilliant story. Deep Rock Galactic is a very well put together PvE FPS experience that is just about having fun. Developed as an indie game by Ghost Ship Games, it has drawn an amazing community that has remained loyal and able to joke with developers about dipping their balls in steamy Morkite. While the shooting isn't the most innovative thing, having it combined with mining while also having monster aliens come at you, it honestly leads to a pretty fun game that doesn't suffer too much as it's more an inspired game rather than a, copied game. The final big FPS game would be Valorant, coming in mid-2020. Valorant was a mix of CSGO and Overwatch as it used heroes in a tactical shooter environment. On release, it was constantly compared to CSGO, but never quite able to turn veteran CSGO fans as it continued to overshadow Riot's new game. Valorant was probably the easiest tactical shooter to come out as the skill gap wasn't as large being a new game and it had less punishing mechanics, allowing a more run and gun style for those who love to frag rather than rely on utilities. Valorant would go on to have a successful esport and even winning an award for it. It was a fresh face in the tactical shooter market, even with R6 and CSGO continuing to grow. A lot of games were delayed during 2020, which led to a lot of releases all over 2021. The first big FPS game would be Resident Evil Village in May. This is the first Resident Evil title on the list because I'm not familiar with the franchise, but I do know they have remained a very constant horror juggernaut. I'm not sure when they started to go into the FPS genre form, as I know some of the old ones were third person. The game held up with fans as the gameplay was filled with variety in the form of environments and different ways to attack the somewhat bosses of the game. The whole series is amazing and definitely adds a lot to the horror FPS scene. The next major FPS would be Deathloop in September. Deathloop would somewhat blow up as a completely new type of shooter. You could follow stealth or straight up attack to assassinate designated characters while you're also being hunted. A very new take that was eaten up by those searching for something new in the FPS market. Not much has been made to build off Deathloop, so it's kind of hard to see how much it affected FPS games, but innovation's always pretty cool, and you never know what we might see in the coming, 5 or so years. Far Cry 6 came out the next month, and we're moving on. Seriously though, Far Cry is really only going down. Back 4 Blood came out 3 days later. It was called an updated Left 4 Dead as the graphics were very good and in 6 months would boast over 10 million players. In early 2023, developers have no more support for the game. The game unfortunately was not such a good successor to Left 4 Dead as it seemed to lack the soul seen originally 10 years before. After Back 4 Blood, the FPS scene would go back to the more traditional shooters. Call of Duty Vanguard, Battlefield 2042, and Halo Infinite. In May of 2022, a little less than a year after Call of Duty Vanguard's release, Activision admitted that the game failed to reach sales expectations. I'll just leave it there, so you can ponder why that may be. Battlefield 2042 would start well, but the player base would leave fast. Concurrent players on Steam would drop below Farming Simulator 2022. Eventually in December, it would even fall below Battlefield V, which also wasn't even the best game. EA would also announce in 2022 that Battlefield 2042 did not meet sales expectations, blaming a different approach than fans wanted and bugs. Wow, at least they did some self-reflecting. Halo Infinite would actually break the norm set before it by showing a new approach to Halo. It was called Halo as you've never seen, as it went for an open world, causing the campaign to really feel different. Even the multiplayer would be praised as the weapons felt good along with mechanics being ironed out over years of work. The game had bugs on release, but 343 has worked most of them out, showing some genuine care for the veteran franchise. The surprising FPS king of 2021 would actually go to the final game of the year, Ready or Not. Even just releasing in early access, the game perfectly captures the atmosphere and realism of working as a SWAT member. Off to a little bit of a slow start, it would be the best-selling game on Steam the week after release. Ethan Gatch from Kotaku even called it a tactical horror game. as it has taken a lot from Tom Clancy and the SWAT games to make an ultimate simulator for the hardcore tactical FPS lovers. 2022 is a small year for FPS games and probably has the two biggest games for why most people think the mainline FPS genre has died. Firstly, I want to touch on the good. High on Life is an interesting game, not exactly for the humor, unless you're into that, but the design of the weaponry. Getting living guns that talk to you and evolve over time is an interesting idea that somewhat mirrors Scorn, a first-person horror game. Having guns evolve on the body as living things is an interesting combat mechanic and would be cool seeing how they develop to use your whole body, maybe? It's too early to tell if something will come from High on Life or Scorn, but High on Life was something of a novel game in the industry of 2022. So it's time for the bad now. Overwatch 2 and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 are quite possibly the most soulless major FPS games ever. Overwatch 2 is practically a port, and the best parts of Modern Warfare 2 come from the 2019 version through Warzone and the multiplayer maps like Shoot House and Shipment. Both games are a disaster and are shameful cash grabs that deepen the pockets of an already largely successful franchise. But yeah, that's really it from 2022. There wasn't a lot, and well, I'm kind of glad because I'm sure it'd just be more shameless FPS, just dumps, cash grabs, whatever, slop. 2023 is a bit of a weird year and hard to write about, as I'm writing this in late September of 2023. I don't really know how all these games are going to turn out, but some have already dropped the bag down the stairs. So let's go ahead and finish this up, starting with Redfall. Probably the easiest game to talk about because it was terrible. It somehow one-upped Cyberpunk for unplayable game launches and is probably the worst game of the year. Atomic Heart did a little better, but was still not as good as people hoped. It tells a rather bland story, and whilst it shows an amazing open world, the game sparsely uses it, instead focusing on somewhat linear pathing to progress the story. It drives a perfect path into mediocrity, and is yet another FPS failure for this decade already. BattleBit Remastered, on the other hand, is entirely different. Not just in gameplay, but in quality. Instead of focusing on looks, BattleBit gives an extremely engaging FPS experience with 254 player servers, a variety of vehicles, and just too many guns. The developers received way more players than expected and have continued to improve the game and work directly with the community to balance the game issues since the beginning of its release in mid of 2023. It's amazing seeing such passion receiving very deserved praise. Finally, we reached the last remaining games, which have both come out in the current month of September. I want to end on a good note, so I'll start with Payday 3. Starbreeze Studios messed up. They did server tests just a week before and still couldn't have them nearly ready. And honestly, the game doesn't even feel like it's improving on Payday 2 a lot. It does the standard graphics and gunplay buffs, but is really just stripped down. There was so much to Payday 2 because it came out all the way back in 2013, 10 years and 1 month ago. To just release a more basic game that wasn't even ready for launch is stupid. Payday 2 released in a similar condition, so why hasn't the lesson been learned? So many games still make the mistake of just releasing unfinished. Eventually, we'll have a recession of developers that just cleans off the useless ones who have no passion to make an actual product worth paying for. Somehow, most innovation lately is just going to bad games. Innovating practices to make more money or to just have lazier gameplay and story. Taking the whole function out of games, and it has really seeped into the FPS genre as it maintains its position as the most profitable genre in gaming. Finally, we can end on a good note as Counter-Strike 2 was fully released just 3 days ago. After being in beta since March, I had the beta the whole time, and to see it all come together is a joy. The game is really only a sequel in title, as it's just an engine update. Everything besides loadouts, UI, and mechanics have been pretty well maintained. So really, Counter-Strike 2 lacks innovation. It could just be the end of FPS games ever changing. There's always only a finite amount of things to do, and eventually it might just be up to VR and AR, I guess, systems to continue on with groundbreaking updates to technology and the FPS genre with it. In November, COD is supposed to release Modern Warfare 3, and honestly I don't know what they can do to even make it fun. Keep working on Warzone, create a new progression system. Seems doomed before it even releases. The original first-person shooters were amazing games at the time, but today are something of a snooze fest. Very limited movement, gunplay, and graphics because of the hardware they had. They of course succeeded by pioneering something never seen in the video game industry. New cells, old molds. Doom's revolutionary design sold. Half-Life's incredible graphics, storytelling, and gameplay sold. Battlefield's massive battles covered in realism sold. Counter-Strike's simple but tactical gameplay that is still adapted today sold. Halo's incredible groundbreaking multiplayer sold. Fallout's open-world RPG elements sold. BioShock's perfected atmosphere mixed with dark and subtle storytelling sold. Left 4 Dead's addictive co-op zombie shooting sold. Black Ops' expansive zombies gameplay and story sold. Borderlands' large amounts of weapons and items creating the looter shooter sold. Payday's heist-focused gameplay sold. Titanfall's mech and pilot gameplay sold. Rust and DayZ had hardcore survival mixed with PvP that sold. Overwatch added personality to ordinary class systems which sold, and created some interesting content outside the game if you know where to look. Superhot would create an amazing experience, then go to VR and instantly be a favorite and bestseller because of its extreme attributes for an FPS, selling a lot more. Apex Legends took the massive Battle Royale formula and combined it with the amazing shooting of Titanfall and created the best FPS-only Battle Royale, easily selling. Deep Rock Galactic used hardy dwarves in their natural habitat, gave them guns and sent monsters after them, which sold. Ready or Not made you actually feel tense during an FPS by forcing you to work your way past armed lawbreakers while also being mindful of unarmed civilians, which sold. High on Life had stupid humor that was hit or miss and somehow sold through trying to create different ways for them to interact with you. Some games took already established features and made them just amazing for games like Black Ops 2, Payday 2, Borderlands 2. These sold. The level of innovation in the FPS genre is just not high. BattleBit can look like a Roblox server, be designed by 3 people, and still have a higher concurrent player count than Payday 3. It's okay to innovate off already existing entities. Original designs are things of the past, as the FPS genre celebrates over 30 years of success. I and many others don't care if you just need some inspiration to produce an amazing experience for FPS lovers everywhere. We honestly just want the good times back. I appreciate everyone for watching, especially if you made it this far, and I hope you enjoyed the video. This has been Sam with Double Player, and I'll see y'all next time. Take care.